letting you know now, big spoilers ahead. I'm not holding back. So if you have any interest at all in preserving your somehow spoiler-free Last of Us knowledge, right now is the time to get out. So, talk I'm giving today, I'm calling Carving Your Path. It's about why you should never stop finding your way. Now, like I said, I'm Morgan. I am a C11 graduate, which seems simultaneously not that long ago and forever ago. At this point, I have over 10 years professional experience, and right now I am a game designer at Naughty Dog. And I guess, like, to begin, game designer at Naughty Dog is a term that can mean either scripter or layout design. And I am kind of, my core work is as a layout designer, but I also do a lot of scripting. I got my start as a scripter and then transitioned onto the layout side of things. And yeah, that's what I do. And very recently, I hit a huge personal milestone in my career. And it has to do with, give me 1 second here. I'm gonna move this around. There we go, that's better. Sorry, I'm moving the Zoom bar around. It had to do with the launch of this game. You know, we shipped it back on June 19th of this year. And real quick, I wanted to get a quick show of hands, like how many of you have played this game? One, okay. So I was gonna ask then how many have finished this game? All right. Now, out of curiosity, of the people that have finished it, how many of you hated Abby at the beginning of the game? And how about the end of the game? Interesting. Okay. Well, this particular image right here is a little misleading because I did not work at all on Ellie's side of the campaign. I worked on the other half. I worked entirely on the Abby half, the half that Naughty Dog went to extraordinary lengths to keep secret. So the question remains, like, why was there all this secrecy around Abby? And a big reason why is that The Last of Us Part 2 explores how hatred affects us. Like Neil Druckmann, the creative director, has said, if The Last of Us explores the length that a person will go to for love, then The Last of Us Part 2 explores how far we'll go out of hate. And how it eats away at our humanity by enabling us to do things that we know are wrong. Hate blinds us from empathy and makes it easy to other and outgroup those that we hate. And so we wanted to see if audiences would still seek revenge against a character they hate after walking a mile in their shoes. Now, personally, like the whole Abby gambit was what I found most interesting and inspiring about the project when I first joined Naughty Dog. I wanted to know if it was possible to turn, animosity into admiration, and what it would be like when these two protagonists, these dual protagonist stories collide. How would players reconcile this emotional conflict that they would experience? Yeah, I was just eager to see if we could pull it all off. But pulling it off would require that players didn't know that we were trying to pull it off, hence all the secrecy around it. Like, we needed players to hate Abby as much as possible. players need to sympathize with Ellie on her quest for revenge. And the deeper that the players despise Abby, the more significant her redemption becomes. So we needed to design a hatred that could endure for all of Ellie's Seattle campaign. For one, Abby kills Joel in a very despicable and personal way. Joel and his brother Tommy had just rescued Abby from an infected horde, and in return, she slowly beats him to death. And her friends were also very disrespectful, helping to sow like the vitriol of the moment. Furthermore, Ellie is present and powerless as she witnesses Joel's death. It's a really heavy moment. It's unjust, it's unfair, it's unexpected, and it's a shell-shocking turn of events that creates a ton of sympathy for Ellie, frankly, and gets the audience on board as she plots her revenge against Abby and company. And I just wanted to give a quick shout out to the actors. Like this scene, like their performances were incredible. Like it's just written all over Ashley Johnson's face. So it's like heart-wrenching. So, and you know, everyone in that scene was just amazing, spot on that day. So with everyone's hatred, the players, Ellie's friends and family, everyone's hatred in full bloom, Ellie and Dina arrive in Seattle. And this is where we introduce a key method of perpetuating this animosity that they feel. There was a lot of propaganda and vignettes and letters and things that Ellie and Dina find that all kind of paint the WLF as these very, you know, this fascist group of people that, you know, would be harming innocent people and you know, generally being bad guys. And this helped ensure that Abby and the WLF would be perceived as the outgroup. They're strangers to the player and to Ellie. They're on the wrong team, not our team, the good guys, right? And so like tribalization, othering Abby and the WLF makes it a lot easier for the antipathy to stick. And this isn't just conjecture that I'm making up. There are scientific studies that have shown how this effect works. One study in particular that I'm familiar with worked like this. So you would have these people that would go into an MRI and have their brains scanned. And while they were in there, they would be shown this video and they would see just a hand. And shortly thereafter, they would see a sharp object stab the person's hand. Now it was fake, no one actually gets stabbed, but it looked real. And when this would happen, the person's brain would light up with this like heavy emotional response. And that shows how our innate empathy makes us imagine this person's pain and causes us to feel distress. We're distraught when we witness someone else's pain. But that was the control group. And the test group is where things get a little bit more complicated. So they would run the same experiment again, only this time the video had just a caption at the bottom with the names of a person's potential in-group or out-group at the bottom. And that's it. Just a word to imply the tribe, if you will, of the person's hand that's being stabbed. And so when members of the in-group of the test subjects in-group are stabbed, people would tend to show the same emotional response as when there was no caption at all. when it was just a clean slate, and it could be anyone. There's that same strong empathic response. But when members of the out group were stabbed, there is a significant decrease in brain activity where the emotional response resides. Our brains can literally blind us to the pain of those we consider to be the out group. Like that's in our hardware, unfortunately. But it's true. Like we're hardwired to not care as much about people we consider to be out group in the other team. And so by keeping Abby and the WLF at arm's length, it made it easier to not even imagine asking oneself, Ellie, the audience, the player, why Abby and all of them might have killed Joel in the first place. It doesn't matter. The fact is that they did it, and they did it in a horrible way. Ergo, bad guys, hate them, no going back. Let's see this revenge plot through to its end. And so yeah, like this helps to keep you blind. It helps to keep Ellie blind. And it will eventually take her and possibly the player to some dark places. And Ellie will test your patience. She's an imperfect person. She's not striving to be a hero in this story. She acts selfishly a lot. And it makes it harder and harder to justify her actions to yourself as a player, to a point where you might even begin to doubt or even fear her. You ask yourself, like, you ask, how much can you tolerate seeing someone that you love continue to make increasingly self-destructive decisions as she starts to torture and abandon her friends in this like blind quest for revenge. But the notion of trying to understand her enemies is nowhere on her radar. And by keeping it off of her radar, it also helps to keep it off of the player's radar. It keeps, the hatred in the pocket, so to speak. And it keeps the audience, like I said, in sync. It's a big reason why Abby is missing for almost all of Ellie's Seattle campaign. You see her in the prologue in Act 1 when leading up to the inciting incident of the whole game, when she kills Joel, and then she's gone, and she's gone for like 12 hours and only shows up at the very, very end. And a big reason for doing all of this is that knowing too much about Abby's history would really complicate Ellie's and the audience's ability to stay on board with the revenge plot. A big reason for keeping her identity a secret is because players cannot empathize with her too soon. Remember, like, we want to, the goal is to build the hate and have it last, and then start the redemption. And so by most objective standards, Abby grew up as one of the good guys, right? Her dad was the nation's leading researcher, looking for a cure for the infection, in a hope to, save all mankind, or all humankind, from this disease, like to save us all. But as for Abby herself, she's his daughter. She's warm-hearted, good-natured. She's helpful. And so it's only after Joel dooms humanity and orphans Abby by killing her dad and most of the Fireflies that Abby is forced to ultimately move to Seattle and join the WLF in the first place. I mean, she has as good a reason as anyone to seek her revenge. If anything, you're seeing like the end of her revenge story at the very start of Last of Us Part 2, but we didn't see all the interceding years. But for us to really go the full distance on redemption in the eyes of the audience, we have to start off her side of the campaign with that hate like fresh and strong in our hearts. Which is why after spending those 12 hours with Ellie not finding Abby, Abby suddenly steps back into the spotlight and kills Jesse, one of Ellie's close allies, like literally moments before we drastically shift gears. And so with having like built this kind of strong foundation of hate, we pass the protagonist baton and play the gambit of trying to win the audience over by entering the perspective of the despicable monster herself. You know, hopefully audiences can come to see that while Abby might not be a saint, she's a far cry from the villain that she's been made out to be. So while Ellie tests how far you'll go to keep tolerating a loved one's actions, Abby tests how far you'll go to keep your heart hardened towards someone you hate. Can you still hate them after walking a mile in their shoes? Or could you come to understand or even admire this person? It's a question that we wanted to answer ourselves. And personally, like this felt like a monumental task. Because, like, you know, let's be honest, most people aren't really motivated to understand characters that they actively want to see dead. We like confirmation bias. It's easier and almost comfortable to keep Abby as the villain and then kill her and then ride off into the sunset with a big high five. And we knew that many players would be turned off by the idea of spending 12 hours playing the antagonist's campaign. You know, you can't just like slap that on the back of the box. They also won't be eager to abandon their weapon and skill tree progression that they've built thus far with Ellie. And so, but if the idea was that if we caught the audience, the players off guard, then the momentum of the story would keep them engaged long enough for them to become invested in Abby's redemption. And this was another reason to keep Abby's campaign secret. But personally, I was like curious as to how one might go about humanizing someone who has been built up to be this monster, and what it would be like to introduce a bunch of characters that the player would have been uncomfortable about Ellie killing, especially like the recent characters like Mel here and her dog Alice. Players were going to have a hard time getting on board with all this. So when I started at Naughty Dog, like I remember wondering, like, you know, which poor sap of a designer had the task of breaking the player's heart by kicking off Abby's side of the story. And it wasn't until a week later, after joining, that I met the guy. And yeah, it ended up being me. Turns out that task hadn't been assigned yet. So they gave it to the new guy. So the first like major level that I worked on personally was the trip to the forward operating base. And the general setup of it was the gang has been called to the forward operating base in the middle of this big war that their faction, the WLF, is having with another faction, the Seraphites. And then along the way, this complication happens. They get ambushed. They wreck their car, and they have to evade these pursuers and try to make it all the way to the forward operating base on foot. And I saw this personally as Abby's pilot episode. Abby and the gang. You know, we needed to humanize them, but also, you know, as with any pilot episode of anything, there's a heavy degree of exposition going on. So we tried as hard as we could to handle all this exposition via action and gameplay. You know, like if it's if movies or show don't tell, video games are do don't show. And so we wanted you to experience them working as a team against these common enemies in the midst of this ongoing war. And this was also like on the gameplay side, and a chance to showcase their like military weaponry and tactics, which were very different from Ellie's and her friends. And you know, just so you know, like a lot of stuff like as we're in development, a lot of stuff changes along the way. So we kind of always knew that there was going to be like a Seraphite ambush. The WLF call the Seraphites the Scars, and having done the Abby campaign, I called them Scars too. So if you hear me say Scars, I'm talking about the Seraphites. And those are the people that you see on horseback over there, and Abby and the crew are in the Humvee. So yeah, it was originally just going to be an ambush in the car, and they were going to kind of like go down an alley, clear and present danger style. But what we found was the pacing of everything leading up to this point had been really slow. It had been a while since there was a bunch of action. And so it was just kind of like a little boring. And so we like decided to turn the like big chunk of this car ride into this like horse chase ambush, and like, you know, cut like half of the dialogue. So that way we could adjust the pacing and give a chance to give the player a chance to experience what it's like to be in the middle, or in the midst of this ongoing war. We also wanted to show them as like this kind of competent force against the infected. Another kind of tentpole item we wanted to hit for this level was showcasing Alice as a contributor to the team by having her be able to like incapacitate infected and like rescue you from infected. And we also set up this like this big like swarm event inside this like dilapidated hardware store that had a lot of opportunities for the buddies to rescue you. Like there would be runners coming up and trying to like grapple onto you and distract you, while your buddies would come and like pull them off and just try to like build this cycle of teamwork. And this was also like, you know, like kind of the first big go at introducing Abby, all her new weapons, all her crafting recipes and skill trees as well. So that was like ended up being a big part of this level, and tutorializing all of that. But you know, overall, we just wanted we wanted players to get to know them and start to see them as people, and not monsters. And so that means doing stuff like giving them tests that demonstrate their character, and also start to convey a bit about some of the like more complicated relationships. For instance, Mel, who you can see on that boat in the boat repair shop, like she and Abby are kind of caught in a love triangle, and Abby does some kind of wrong and hurtful things toward Mel that kind of complicate their relationship later on. And so like it was important that we kind of established Mel at this point as a strong contributor. She's like, despite being, 7 or 8 months pregnant, she's like climbing up, and we set up these ways to have Abby basically relying on her before feeding back and having her rely on Abby, like that they needed each other to help kind of sow that bond. And overcoming obstacles is a great way of bringing groups together, and so setting all this up allowed us to do that. And in a way, it also like kind of begs the audience to start taking part in the big group hug, even though they might not yet be ready to like everyone in the group just yet. But it's like a reason to start chipping away at that armor around their hearts. And kind of like the last big sequence of this level was that we wanted to also show how they were still vulnerable, and that this war that they're taking part in is much bigger than them. Like this setup for this scene at the like gas station holdout starts off with the player not having any good cover to go to, and being just like overwhelmed with Scar's approaching their position from every side, and there's just like no good options. Like there's no choice but to kick off combat, and the only place that you can do that you can actually move to safely is inside the gas station. Like if you can see in the back, there's that semi with the big pipe on the trailer. Like that was basically like the perfect flank position that Scars could take up and just basically like eliminate any cover positions that the player might possibly have. There was like no choice but to go and hide behind this counter in the gas station, because we wanted to like them to feel desperate, and there ended up being I ended up scripting this whole event myself, and it was by far the most complicated thing I've ever scripted in my life. But like one of the facets of it was we were like checking for all sorts of different conditions to eventually like make sure that the player had hit their limit in a quick enough amount of time, that they were like out of ammo, out of health, and that like the right people had been injured, and that the right enemies were showing up to like start pointing you in the right direction, getting you to look in the right direction as your reinforcements show up and eventually like come and save the day. Like, you're on your last legs and everyone's saying like, I'm out of ammo, we're screwed, it's over. And then, the WLF show up and just like mow everyone down, which in itself was like a crazy scripting task because like of performance. There was too many AI. I had to completely fake all of the buddies in the back of that second truck. Like they were like not AI at all. Everything was completely faked, but the ones in the back of the truck closer to us were like half AI. It was complicated. There was like a lot of crazy compromises, but finally it did get there. It just like took a lot longer and with more iteration than I had experienced before. But yeah, it was a hard sequence to get right. I think we got it almost right. I definitely do not think it was perfect. But I think it does sell the moment in the end. And so after this, the gang hops on those trucks, and they finally make it back to the FOB, the forward operating base, and that kind of like wraps up my section of the level. And so like that's my first level. I've just compelled the audience to play as their sworn enemy. And now I'm going to talk about my other level where it's basically an unwinnable boss fight against a plot armored opponent with aim hacks. So in some ways, you could say that my job on The Last of Us Part 2 was to ruin the player's day twice. And you know, this mission ended up being important because it was Abby's first big defeat. She's going to lose her best friend Manny, who you saw in the last level as well. And you know, this reveals to her that there are consequences for her killing Joel, that she's not invulnerable. And prior to this, from Abby's perspective, like she hadn't become aware that Ellie had been like trudging through Seattle, like eliminating her friends systematically. Like from her perspective, she was just like wrapped up in her own with her, like she had her own shit to deal with at that point, and was dealing with it, and it was finally here where like the story's lines intersect for the first time, because the sniper that's currently impeding Abby's ability to continue living is none other than Tommy Miller himself, Joel's brother, who taught Ellie how to snipe in another level that the player had already played prior to this. The goal of this entire sequence was to have the player feel just as shocked, defeated, and helpless as Abby does when Manny dies. We want the player with her in that moment, and you know, making all that work hinged on us hitting a few kind of key goals. For one, Manny needs to be a rock star in this. He needs to be like the best buddy out of all buddies. We want him to be coordinating efforts, calling out movements, feeding back. He would also do things like kicking, like he would kick off this big chase sequence later on by going aggro and laying down suppressive fire, which like forces Tommy to ditch an advantageous position. You know, you're depending on him just as much as he's depending on you, and for what it's worth, it is like vitally important that he does depend on you as well. It's not like, you know, we don't want this to be just like a follow sequence. So on the street, the player is leading for probably like 90% of it. And there are a few cases where like Manny gets ahead, but the player's leading the way and Manny's offering support. But then at a certain point, the player gets pinned down by Tommy, and then that's when Manny steps up and kicks off the chase. Like they're helping each other constantly. Now, as for the Tommy, the sniper himself, he's got to be a shadow. That means, you know, you don't ever get a good look at him. And this was something that we were like very conscientious of. At the beginning, all that you see is a lens flare. As you get closer, like we would, you never actually get a clear look at him until the final cinematic. And so we had this idea of what I called increasing resolution. So from this distance, from like the far distance away when you're on the street, you would only see the lens flare. And as you would start making progress and gain on him, you would increase the resolution of how much of Tommy you could see. You know, you would see a silhouette at the next stage. And then from the bridge, he would be backlit or in the shadows predominantly, to where you were only seeing at best silhouettes. And then once we get to like the final stage, he's always moving. So and there's a lot of parallax in that setting. And I'll show that one to you later. but it keeps him very elusive. He's slippery, and you never really get a good look at him. And beyond that, like, he also can't ever get shot himself, because there's clearly a lot of like narrative implications there if you're able to shoot him in the head. And so we had to do all sorts of tactics to make sure that, you know, you are not ever able to get a bead on him, that he can always like shoot you before you shoot him. And then like scripted a lot of, like, there's a huge like dynamic dialogue system for Manny to like handle all of these different cases. Like if the player starts aiming, and the player's aiming starts getting close to Tommy, then Manny will shout out like, he's too far, like, don't waste your bullets, he's too fast, stuff like that. And so yeah, like you can't ever hit him. And then like later on, he's always moving. Every time he shoots you, every time you try to take a shot, he's out of there. And probably one of the biggest things was that we wanted to make sure that the player really earns every single like missed shot that Tommy takes. He needed to feel just truly formidable. The player needed to feel like they are under constant pressure. And so like we had a rule, we weren't gonna do any freebies or warning shots. Even though we ended up having just one. There was one warning shot that we added later. But from the high level, no warning shots. He doesn't miss even if you're sprinting. You have to earn every single missed shot by getting close to cover as quickly as you can. Player has to use all of the environment, all of the movement, the traversal mechanics to get by unscathed. So you can kind of see in this picture, like there are all these paths for like using prone cover from the bridge, crouch cover. One of the hallmarks that players really enjoyed was you can see that semi that's right there on the edge. Like you can start proning under that, and you start and from within that you like enter the water and start prone swimming under the truck, and then you're kind of stealth swimming up to the next area. That felt really satisfying when players found that. Yeah, like you had to judge distances accurately and coordinate with Manny. For instance, we have like this cart sequence at the end of the street where before you're able to enter the parking garage, you have to use this like rickety old cart that has all this kind of old equipment on it, and that's your cover, and you're like, it's moving cover, and each shot that Tommy takes is like knocking more of that cover away to where you are slowly losing, or very quickly rather, losing your cover while just trying to cross the street, like the longest gap that is on the whole street. And we wanted the sniper to feel like a real thorn in your side by using clever tactics. So like, for instance, in this section, the sniper would be luring infected towards you by shooting like metallic objects that are in your vicinity. And so there's a whole bunch of clickers and shamblers and runners down at the end of that parking garage, and they all start swarming you, and it's a very difficult fight to try to avoid sniper fire, like stay behind cover from sniper fire while also like dodging all of these infected that are advancing like within melee range to you. There's a lot of push and pull going on that fans really seem to enjoy. And for what it's worth, I mentioned earlier that there was like another sequence where Tommy teaches Ellie how to snipe and actually teaches her this trick. And so it's like an example of how we make games. Like the designer who was working on that level played this section and was like, ooh, it it'd be cool if Tommy taught this tactic to Ellie, so that way it would feel kind of like familiar and clever when the player finally got to this point. And so they integrated that into their section. And finally, like the last thing is that the player can't see any of this coming. Excuse me. We needed to distract the player by making them just entirely focused on winning. They needed to feel like Tommy was back on his heels, and that they were like cornering him. They've increased the resolution over and over again, to where like they're now fighting in the same space as him. And you know, the screenshot is a little misleading because Tommy's moving the whole time, so you still aren't getting a good glimpse of him. But we wanted the player, like after like all of this pain that they've experienced, just getting to this point, to finally feel like they're finally about to get him. They're just this chomping at the bit. That all that they're thinking about is the fact that they get him. And so we end up cornering him inside of this restaurant within a cruise ship terminal, which feels like cornering him because there's only ocean on the other side. There's like nowhere else left for him to go. And what we wanted really was for the player to next feel like victory had been stolen from them, that they had been outsmarted. And so as simple as this scene looks, it was actually like a lot of iteration to find just the right setup to where players would fall for it. So what happens is like there's a door in kind of in the shadows to the right that you can see, and Tommy goes into the main door that's more toward the center under where it says Beacon Run. So Tommy goes in through there, and the player then is going to get the drop on him by going to the side door. There's a familiar like door bash setup that I had set up previously in the hardware store of the last level that I was talking about, that I showed you, the forward base one. And so it kind of like there was a mimicry of the setup for that, so that way it felt natural. Like the player knew like they're going to go through the next door, they're gonna bust it open, and you know, finally take this guy out. And it's at that moment when they're on the cusp of victory that you find out that Tommy had doubled back and that you had cornered yourself. And there was nowhere to go, and he takes out Manny just as you think you're about to bust in. And the player, you know, Abby crashes through the door, and that's when she has that moment of shock and that moment of defeat. And, you know, I got to say, like, overall, the sequence worked. It worked really well. Players, it was awesome seeing like the reaction videos from all the focus tests that we did, and then after the game launched, like a lot of drop jaws. It feels like we really caught everyone off guard. So yeah, and that's the sniper level. But you know, it's important to keep in mind that this level was all part of a larger portrait of Abby's redemption. And I do want to point out also, I speak very possessively about all of this, but this was a huge team effort. There was a lot of inputs from a ton of talented people. I worked with I co-designed it with a great designer named Asher. And there was help all around. Everyone was on point. I just get to be the one that talks to you about it, but it's definitely all of ours. But Abby's redemption story is also a small part of even a larger portrait than that of Ellie's journey through grief. And all this leads to what I personally found to be two of the most conflicted, like, boss fight encounters I've ever experienced in my entire life. I had never known what it was like to not want to win a fight before like this, because I'm rooting for both of them and none of them at the same time. It's a big reason why, like, I personally love The Last of Us Part 2. I think it's a great game. I think it's a work of art that speaks for itself, and I feel very fortunate to have gotten a chance to play a part in bringing it to life. It was like a truly huge personal milestone. And so that kind of raises the question, like, why was this one so special? I've worked at an array of studios on other games that I'm proud of that have, like, had critical acclaim. But this one felt different, and the reason why is that at a certain point, you know, my resume looked like this, without that one little line in the corner, but that was the best that PowerPoint gave me for blank screen, given the theme. But yeah, at one point I had nothing. And so back before I would eventually decide to make a career for myself in video games, I would think a lot about how I wanted to spend my life. And for me personally, I kept going back to thinking about, like, the books that I read and movies I watched when I was younger that really shaped and reshaped my mind and how it perceives the world around me. And I wanted to make something like that, like, more than anything. For me, narrative has always been king. For a while in my youth, I thought I wanted to be a novelist. But to the surprise of probably, like, no one here at all, I did kind of enjoy playing games more than I liked reading. I liked reading, I did, but it was what I did after I played games. But, you know, at that point in my life, I still hadn't played a game that affected me as deeply as, you know, books like 1984 or movies like Seven did. And I found this confusing, frankly, because the way I saw it, like, video games should be better than all other forms of media when it comes to storytelling. Like, no other medium can blur the line between audience and protagonist. Like, none. No other medium can conjure pride for the audience who experiences it in nearly the same way. I personally saw games as capable of reaching people on a deeper emotional level than anything that has come before them. And realizing this fact is how I fell in love with the idea of making games. So I came to the Guildhall because one day I wanted to make and work on games that could change the way people see the world, in the same way that those books and movies did for me. So, you know, came to Guildhall, did the work, made some of those, you know, lasting, lifelong friendships, and finally got my first job. But achieving my bigger goals wouldn't turn out to be as straightforward as I had assumed. Many factors will divert your journey, divert you from that path along the way. The job market won't always be what you want it to be. There might not be the job that you're looking for right away. Money concerns always complicate things. Also, starting a family, having children can definitely do that, which affects money side for sure. But I would also come to find out that even your own success can, in some ways, be a burden sometimes. So some of you might be thinking, burden of experience. Like, what the fuck does that actually mean? Just stop whining. You've made it. You've got a job. You're doing great. What do you have to complain about? Well, I'll tell you, people, companies, studios are only ever going to ask you to do what you've already proven to be good at. Like, no one's ever going to invite you to pursue your dreams, right? It's not going to happen. And so, like, this, when I look back, I basically had a decade-long journey to get to this point. Having graduated Guildhall in 2010. At the very, very beginning, it was actually, I graduated like December 2009 and then started work in January 2010. But I spent the first like 7.5 years of my career, definitely lucky enough to work at a company like id. It's an amazing studio. It's filled with hugely talented people who all helped me grow into the designer that I am now. I owe them a debt of gratitude. It was a great experience. And in my time there, I was able to hone a lot of skills that would make me a viable candidate to work at a number of studios. But so, like, kind of stepping through my experience there after Rage shipped, I tried applying for like narrative designer roles at other studios, but they weren't really interested due to lack of relevant experience. I had been scripting shooters. And in the years between Rage and Doom shipping, as Doom was getting into production, I became a dad, which was incredible, awesome, greatest thing I've ever done by far. But it completely altered my priorities in ways I couldn't have anticipated. I felt the need to ensure that I always had a strong, like a regular paycheck. And it started making me not assume extra risk. And so, like, I kind of abandoned any sort of start my own indie studio dream at that point. I needed to make sure that I was always able to make rent, and so money became an important factor. But also, after Doom shipped, I felt very empowered. Like, Doom had been well reviewed. People liked it, and I was getting a lot of calls from recruiters and taking interviews, but I actually wasn't doing very well on them. Not nearly as well as I would have expected. And a big reason was that they all wanted me to work on combat design, combat layouts, things like that. And at that point, I was good at mocking up those layouts, plotting enemy patrol routes, but I was by no means eager to talk about it with someone. Like, it was, my eyes would kind of like glaze over. And I was not interested. I wanted to do something else, but I wasn't aware of that at the time. At that point, yeah, I was tired of shooters and ranged combat in general, and it really showed. And so when I realized what was happening, that was when I refocused my efforts and remembered, recalled why I wanted to make games in the first place. And it was frustrating because I felt like kind of pigeonholed. But shipping a game is a great opportunity to take stock of your life and your goals. Have you made progress toward them? Are you still moving in the right direction? And so when I took that moment to reflect and considered my achievements over the interceding years, I realized I wasn't pointing in the right direction, and I needed to change course. So when I heard about like this opening at the same studio that made Journey, I threw everything I had at that design test. I felt like I needed to prove that I understood how to use game design in ways that incite like a pantheon of emotions, and that I was more really than an action thrill factory. Oops. Sorry about that. After pouring my heart into that 2-week project, I ended up landing the job and swapped from one end of the 3D genre spectrum, like all the way to the other, going from working on like the super violent shooters to the super friendly, altruistic Sky Children of the Light. And all of this, it gave me a huge sense of accomplishment and a lot of confidence in my ability to handle narrative. And I'm certain at this point that, you know, my experience with that game company contributed to finally getting hired at Naughty Dog. At that point, I could prove that I understood how to design for both action and emotion, which is kind of like a pillar of Naughty Dog's studio identity. So kind of coming now back to the present and why The Last of Us Part 2 was so important to me. It's the first game I personally have worked on that I believe affects audiences in the ways that I'd always aspired to. Maybe not everyone, but there's a lot of people who this game has had a very strong effect on. The game digs deep. And so I felt a great sense of personal accomplishment getting to take part in creating this experience. But I wouldn't have been able to get here if I hadn't taken those opportunities to introspect, to take stock of my career and refocus my efforts by remembering what I found most important, which kind of brings me to the biggest message that I want to leave with everyone here. Remember why you fell in love in the first place. Never forget that. It will clear the fog and it'll keep you pointed in the right direction as you carve out your own path ahead, even if it does take a decade to get there. Thank you very much. And at that, I'd like to open the floor. Anyone for Q&A?
That was excellent. Thank you so much, Morgan. That was fantastic.
You're welcome.
So yeah, let's open the floor to Q&A here. Let's start off. If you have a question, we'll start with.
I need to stop sharing my screen.
We just ask you raise your hand, and it looks like we already have some folks who've done that. Forgive me if I get any pronunciation incorrect here, but Kuei Zhang, it looks like your hand has been up for a while, so I'm going to let you go ahead and unmute yourself.
Actually, am I still presenting? Because I'm trying to. Okay, would you mind?
Yeah, unspotlight you.
Yes, thank you. So that way I can actually see everyone.
Yeah. Let's see. 1 second.
I'm just not seeing that pop up on the Zoom menu from where I'm at now. Oh, I see it now.
You see it now? Okay, great.
All right.
Okay, let's see. I had asked Kuei Zhang to speak, but it looks like I don't see him anymore. So I'm going to move on to the next. Cole Morgan, you've had your hand up. Feel free to ask your question.
Yeah, so there was a comment that you made concerning the chase sequence that you had worked on, and like cutting a dialogue section for the action sequence to change up the pacing. And I was wondering, like, how far along in development of that level and like that scene did that decision get made, and what were the consequences of like what got cut in that situation?
I mean, that one in particular was one of the like less stressful ones. You know, we had recorded dialogue, but like the level itself was still entirely block mesh. Yeah, there was like not a lot lost on on kind of like the downstream end of things from design. Like not a lot of artist or animator time was lost, I believe. Actually, there might have been some animator time lost due to having to like previs the animation sequence of the conversation. So like there was stuff that was other stuff that was like way worse in terms of like the lost time aspect of it than this one. But good question.
Thank you, Cole. Looks like James Nicholson, you are next.
Right. Hi.
Hello.
I was wondering, I've heard that Naughty Dog works a little bit differently than some other game studios. What can you run through, like what pipeline, a typical day of pipeline for getting a level out there is like for you?
So yeah, one way that Naughty Dog is different from a lot of studios that was very different from id is that there's like not a lot of production roles. They tend to leave level production up to the layout designer. Like that's kind of your job, is to be the producer for your level and coordinate with all the other departments. Like your level, the stuff on your level is not getting done unless you are active and involved in getting it done. Whereas, compared to like when I was working at id, stuff was getting done way like beyond my knowledge. Like I would like find out that like art had done a pass while I was like working on another level. Like I'll just come back and be like, find that my level had been arted up, and I would just like, I would be unaware of that because it was all handled by production.
So do you prefer that, like which model do you prefer? Like,
well, I mean, like I definitely prefer this one. I like the heavier authorship. I like being able to talk to people when I need to and not have to go through a middleman. I also, but it's like, I definitely put a lot of I put a lot of authorship into everything I make, and I want to be involved at every stage, and I just like talking with people and setting all that up. I like being able to go to the mocap stage if I need to.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, James. Aubrey, you are next. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Since a lot of us are just getting started in, the production aspect, and I wouldn't say that Guildhall is like an echo chamber, because we get good feedback from the professors and our peers.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't have to deal with the vitriol that y'all do. So how do you deal with that?
When you say vitriol, could you be a little bit more specific? Which vitriol? We get as a designer, man, you get vitriol from everywhere.
So I mean, obviously you're going to have the just the trolls online. You just ignore them. But what about like legitimate reviewers who just like take a dump on you that may or may not be unfair, or just like the fan response? Like how do you deal with that? Do you just develop thick skin? Or
I mean, yeah, like, speaking for myself, I think the game speaks for itself.
Yeah.
I think that the right decisions were made at every stage. There was a good reason for it. people are very free to disagree, but like if I didn't feel that like as confident as I do in our game, then I might feel differently. But it it was a little weird, just the degree of hostility that like after launch. But a lot of it also, I mean, I don't want to get into like which groups of people felt A or B and start categorizing people that way. Beyond the people that I don't think we're going to like it regardless of anything else. It did feel odd and at times ironic. Some of that negative feedback, but like I said, I think we made the right choices. I think it speaks for itself, and in the end, that's kind of like the best that you can hope for. It makes it easier to not be hurt by all that.
Awesome. Thank you, Aubrey, for your question. Arthur, it looks like you are next. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, so I'm actually working on my thesis right now about emotionally coded backstories influencing how players view gameplay actions.
Fantastic.
So having two NPCs, quest givers, who will give you very different perspectives on on one set of actions. So same quest line, two different backstories.
Like what is it? Kokoro? Not. Is that it? The Kurosawa classic?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a breakup and each gives a different perspective on what you're doing.
Right.
And the like. But while you were talking, you mentioned briefly like seeing people play it and feeling like, oh, like we nailed this emotional moment. Do you have any advice on when you're getting playtests, that sort of thing, especially looking at narrative and emotions, how to make sure you're sort of getting what you're going for with your players, making sure that you are understanding how they're feeling about it?
I mean, it's reaction. Like when someone feels despair, like really feels it, like you'll know. The thing, if it's a strong reaction, if it's a medium reaction, you won't. But then you have to ask, was it a medium reaction that you were going for? Like believe it or not, the hardest emotion to decipher is if they're having fun, because a lot of times looking like someone is having fun just looks like they're kind of like just thinking. They're people will like rate things like, oh, this was the most fun I've ever had, but they're just stoic looking the whole time. I think that's just kind of like, ingrained in a lot of like how gamers play games. They're just kind of used to that, and thinking, learning itself is what makes fun a lot of the time, and that doesn't always have a smile on your face. A joke will put a smile on your face, but fun won't always. So that one's hard to tell. But like the other emotions, you can tell when they land just by the reaction. Now, as far as like how you hone it and become better, that's hours and hours of talking, and probably beyond the scope of today's conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you, Arthur. Cole, it looks like you have another question. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
Yeah, so I know that there is a lot of variability within the gaming industry on like what roles do what and the names of them in particular. But I was curious as to, like, I know you mentioned that you worked a lot on like layout design and scripting as well. But I'm really curious what the like flow of decisions is for like what the final product is going to be. Like, do you start off with what the overarching story is going to be, and then break that down into like individual scenes that then get handed off to design teams? Or I'm curious what the whole structure behind how the game gets made is.
Sure. So one thing that's been, I guess, fairly consistent is that like kind of the prompts you'll get will be that there is some kind of like, it's either like a couple of core narrative beats. Here are the characters coming in. Here's where we want them to be at the end. You figure out the middle. Sometimes there'll be like a specific setting that they want to go for because it matters. Sometimes it'll be like, this is the enemy introduction level. This is the weapon introduction. You're going to be given a few dots that are kind of scattered across the map, and it's your job to create all the interceding dots between them and make sure that they all connect and connect and flow at the right time. And but yeah, like, and for what it's worth, also I have found that, at least in my experience, I know this isn't everyone's experience, that, you know, a lot of the like narrative and dialogue gets worked out in that process. It's not like I'm not getting the full script right away, because the script would imply that we know exactly where the characters are going to be and what they're going to be looking at, and they don't know yet. Like, you know, especially with Naughty Dog, the goal is to keep the player in that moment and keep the characters in that moment with the player, to where everyone's kind of reacting to the same stuff at the same time, player and characters, and you know, you're constantly keeping everyone aligned, and that requires like kind of knowing what the player could be dealing with in the world at that moment. And if you try too hard to like author that top down, you end up having to make all sorts of weird concessions in the design along the way. And then I think a lot of people found that that's not the most effective way to like get the best experience. It's when there's that you know, a dialogue between design and writing, I think.
Thank you, Cole.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Jonathan, it looks like you are next. Feel free to unmute and ask your question.
All right.
Rashomon, thank you. Sorry, I just saw it in the chat. Yes, it was Rashomon. Forgive me for missing that.
All right. So you've been in the industry now 10 years, and you talked a lot about your experience with Naughty Dog. Naughty Dog has a reputation, I guess, having crunch culture.
Sure.
I was curious what your experience was with that. Were you able to keep a decent work-life balance throughout it, and also just at your previous companies?
So I'll say that dating back to the Guildhall, I have always, I won't say that I'm a workaholic, but I am definitely like always pushed that boundary. Like I have never been good at letting details slide. You know, I would kind of like, for better or worse, when I was at Guildhall, I would find that with each successive module, I would add one extra all-nighter. So like my very first module, I had one all-nighter. Second module, I had 2 all-nighters, and this like kept going. And you know, just like how no one at the school, if the school knew I was pulling that many all-nighters, they would have probably told me to stop. But by nature, I'm very perfectionist, and so like that kind of characteristic kept with me as I was at it. I would, you know, I was very frequently the last one to leave. And so it's never felt for me like weird to work the extra hours. But at the same time, I have a lot of sympathy for like, I've never been one to say that people should like to look down on and we're like, why are you only here 8 hours? Like you've worked 8 hours, you've done what you said you were going to do. I think that that's fantastic. I've like found ways of like reconciling my work goals and my family life by, for instance, I live very close to the studio. I live like within half of a mile because I come home every night to see my kid, have dinner with them, you know, read him a book, get him ready for bed, spend that time with him. And then if I'm in the middle of, you know, if I'm deep in production, I then go back to the studio after he goes to sleep. I've just found a way of making it work. So with that, like I've never at any studio I've ever worked at, I've never once heard you have to stay and work all the extra hours. But I kind of do it anyway. And it's a very complicated thing to talk about because in a lot of ways it is kind of like wrapped up in my identity. Does that answer your question?
I think,
okay.
you know, as a student, we're not, we definitely know just, we have to work long hours for school. So it's not like we're going to industry. It'll probably be, if I do 8-hour work days, it'll probably be a significant drop depending on where I was in school. So I'm not against that balance or not against like working overtime. I was just curious how it was for you. And I think you answered it. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Jonathan. Okay, so Shreyas, it looks like you might be our last question. Feel free to unmute and ask away.
Hello. So I have a question. Even
Shreyas, it looks like you muted yourself.
Yeah, did you mute yourself?
sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry about that. So Ivan Hill from Naughty Dog, I mean, he mentioned once that the museum scene took like almost 2 years to develop. So I'm curious as to like how much of work is actually being cut from the final game. It's like 2 years is quite a long time, right? So
2 years from the museum got cut?
No, it took 2 years to make the museum level. So I'm curious, like since it takes 2 years, if it takes 2 years to make one level, how much of work is actually being cut at the end of the day? And it's like, is everything that we do on a day-to-day process like just like blocking out, redoing it, and blocking out, redoing it again until we find perfection?
I mean, yeah. Like I do think, in my experience, Naughty Dog has spent a lot longer than other studios I've worked at the like block mesh stage, and continually like reworking them until it lands. As far as like stuff that gets cut late, you know, like the truly like, because I'll say I do think that the iteration and getting it right is like, that is the design job. Like that's what you signed up for. That's the job, is that constant iteration. But when we start, so I don't think that like, I don't consider scrapping a design idea and redoing a block mesh, like that's not waste of time as much as it is like just part of the job. Like the waste of time is when, unfortunately, you know, you lose time that animators and artists and you know, even if it's like programmers and their features have worked on, and that's always harder to make. It's always harder to make those cuts. I found that, like, you know, usually those cuts end up becoming more of a factor of, like, I mean, at a certain stage, it's like pacing. Like if the game is not being paced, if things start getting too slow, and you kind of or just catch that too late, then that'll be a reason to cut like a big chunk of something. But then, you know, perennially there's the production concerns. Like, are we going to be able to polish all of it? And, you know, like, there are all sorts of different factors that happen. Like, people might, like, leave the studio, or they could get sick or something, and then, like, now you've, like, don't have, like, critical personnel for, you know, a critical month, and it's like, okay, well, we got to still keep this thing going. I'm kind of meandering. Like, is that, like, the answer to your question? Shreyas, if you're talking, you're still muted.
Oh, sorry, my speaker. Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Morgan, we can't thank you enough for your time. This has been beyond valuable. And yeah, we're just super grateful, and hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. And
yeah,
again,
thank you very much. I hope you all found it useful and enlightening and all of that.